You ever hear a war story so perfect it feels rehearsed? That's Rex Hartwell in the Rusty Photon, spinning tales of 60 Kitharan shock troops. But when Major Zara walks in, she doesn't just correct his math. She asks why he needs the lie. What happens when two soldiers from opposite sides meet in a bar where gravity glitches and the truth weighs more than pride? You know, the kind of place where war stories get better with each drink. Kepler Station's dive bar had that worn-down, lived-in feel. The kind of joint where the gravity generator sputters like an old engine and the air tastes like recycled metal and ozone. It wasn't clean. It wasn't flashy. It was just real. In one corner, a veteran pilot held court, his voice cutting through the low hum of machinery and murmured conversation. He spoke with the kind of easy confidence that comes from surviving things others only hear about. Around him, the room itself seemed to resist stability. Every now and then, the artificial gravity would dip just enough to make your drink slosh, or the lights would flicker like a bad omen. It made everything feel temporary, like the whole place might come apart if you listened too closely. Behind the scarred synth-wood bar stood a pirate with a torn tentacle, methodically polishing glasses with a rag that had seen better days. He didn't say much, just watched. His eyes moved from patron to patron, taking in the boasts and the bravado without judgment. He'd heard it all before. The close calls, the heroic stands, the near misses. His silence felt heavier than any story being told. At a nearby table, a Rigelian merchant sat alone, fingers tracing the rim of his glass. He wasn't drinking much, just watching, calculating like he was assessing risk in real time. And in the shadowy corner, a service droid stood perfectly still, its single red optic recording everything. No one paid it much mind. Droids were part of the furniture in places like this, silent witnesses to the theater of human and alien folly. This wasn't one of those glossy starship lounges where officers sip synth whiskey and talk policy. This was where stories went to get rough around the edges, where alcohol and pride worked together to sand down the inconvenient parts of the truth. You could feel it in the air, the way laughter came a little too loud, the way nods of agreement were a little too eager. It was the perfect environment for fiction. Every element in that bar conspired to make lies sound plausible. The flickering lights, the unreliable gravity, the worn-down faces of people who'd seen too much. It all added up to a stage where exaggeration felt more honest than fact. When reality's that unstable, who's to say what really happened? So the scene was set. A man telling a story he almost believed himself, surrounded by an audience hungry for heroes, in a place where reality was negotiable. It was only a matter of time before something or someone pulled the thread and unraveled the whole tale. Look, every bar has that guy who fought the impossible battle. That was Rex Hartwell, 3-tour veteran Vega Prime campaign. Bronze star pinned to his jacket like it was part of his uniform. He had the lean look of someone who'd seen combat. Not starved, but trimmed down to essentials. The kind of guy who could make a story about standing his ground against overwhelming odds sound like he was just recounting his grocery list. He leaned against the bar, one boot propped on the rail, and laid out the Vega Prime engagement like he was narrating a tactical training vid. Said he was surrounded by 50, maybe 60 Kitharan shock troops, outnumbered, outgunned, but never outsmarted. He described the choke point he'd used, the way he'd funneled them into a kill zone, the precise angles of fire. His voice never wavered. It was smooth, practiced, the kind of delivery you only get from telling the same story enough times that the edges wear down. He talked about the heat of plasma fire, the smell of scorched armor, the sound of Kitharan combat chatter over open comms, how he'd held them off until reinforcements arrived. Narrow escape, heroic last stand, all the classic beats. You could see the crowd leaning in. The Rigelian merchant had stopped pretending to check his data slate. Even the pirate bartender had paused his wiping. They were buying it. Because who doesn't love a good underdog story? But here's the thing about stories that sound too perfect. They often are. The numbers didn't quite line up. 50 to 60 shock troops in one engagement. That's not a skirmish, that's a full-scale assault. And the way he described the Kitharan tactics? A little too by the book. A little too clean. Real combat's messier. It's confusion, bad intel, lucky breaks. Not this polished narrative where every move makes sense in hindsight. Hartwell wore that bronze star like it was armor against doubt, and for most people in that bar it worked. They saw the metal, they heard the confidence, and they didn't question it. But if you've been around actual combat, You develop a sense for when the math doesn't add up, when a story feels a little too rehearsed, a little too convenient. At one point you start to wonder, not because you doubt his courage, maybe he was brave as hell, but because the details feel like they've been sanded smooth. Like a stone that's been handled so much it loses its edges. That's the thing about war stories. The best ones aren't always the truest ones, and sometimes, the only person who can really challenge a story like that is someone who was standing on the other side of that choke point, someone who heard the same plasma fire, smelled the same scorched earth but counted different numbers. Let me tell you about the moment the room changes. There's no announcement, no grand entrance, just a shift in atmosphere, like pressure dropping before a storm. The door hisses open and she steps inside. Kitharin military, no question about it. Not the hulking shock troop type you see in propaganda reels. This one moved like a blade. Economical, precise, no wasted motion. She didn't look around like she was searching for someone. She already knew who she was here to see. She took a seat at the far end of the bar, her back to the wall, eyes scanning the room without seeming to. You could tell she'd done this before. Assessed terrain, identified threats, calculated exits. Her uniform was crisp but showed wear at the cuffs. No rank insignia, but you don't need badges to recognize command presence. The way she held herself, back straight, shoulders relaxed but ready, said she was used to being listened to. Hartwell didn't notice her at first. He was too wrapped up in his own performance, gesturing broadly as he described flanking maneuvers and covering fire, but the regulars noticed. The pirate bartender's wiping slowed. The Regellian merchant sat a little straighter. Even the service droid's red optic lens seemed to brighten, pivoting almost imperceptibly in her direction. This wasn't another drunk spacer looking for a story. This was someone who might have one of her own. She ordered a drink, something clear, no ice, and just listened. Didn't interrupt, didn't react. Just let Hartwell keep talking, digging his hole deeper with every polished anecdote. There was a patience to her that felt dangerous, the kind of quiet that comes before artillery fire. You could see her taking mental notes, cross-referencing his version against whatever she knew to be true. Her expression gave nothing away. No smirk, no frown, just calm observation. I found out later she was Major Zara, 3rd Assault Division, currently on medical leave. Not the kind of detail you lead with in a place like the Rusty Photon, but it explained the aura. She had that look you see in career soldiers who've been through real combat. Not the glorified kind, the messy, bloody, mistake-riddled kind. The kind that teaches you to spot fiction from a mile away. The energy in the room shifted from celebration to something closer to an interrogation. Hartwell's audience was still there, but their laughter came quieter now, their nods more hesitant. They could feel it too, the presence of a witness. Not just any witness, but one who might have been on the other side of the story he was telling. Someone who counted different casualties, remembered different orders, saw a different war. She didn't need to say a word to challenge him. Her silence did the work for her. It hung in the air between his sentences, a quiet counterpoint to his bravado. You could see Hartwell beginning to sense it, the way a performer feels when the audience stops buying the act. He started glossing over details he'd emphasized earlier, smoothing out inconsistencies before they could be questioned. But it was too late. The damage was done. By the time she finally took her first sip of that clear drink, the trial was already underway. No gavel, no jury, just the unspoken weight of someone who knew the difference between a war story and an after-action report. And Hartwell? He kept talking, but the certainty in his voice had thinned. Like he knew the first crack had already appeared, and it was only a matter of time before the whole story shattered. So Hartwell's in mid-flow, painting this picture of desperate valor against impossible numbers. 60 Kitharin shock troops bearing down, no way out. Then Zara speaks. No theatrics, no grand interruption, just a calm, clear voice cutting through the haze of synthale and sweat. The after-action reports, she says, listed 12 enemy combatants, and one combat droid that malfunctioned halfway through the engagement. You could feel the air go out of the room. Not 60, 12. Plus a droid that basically short-circuited itself. Hartwell froze mid-sentence, his hand hovering in the air like he'd forgotten what he was about to say. The certainty in his eyes wavered. You could almost see him recalculating, trying to reconcile the story he'd told so many times with the numbers she'd just laid out. It wasn't even close. 12 soldiers and a broken machine. That's a patrol, not an ambush. Not the stuff of legends. He touched his bronze star almost reflexively, like it was a talisman that could ward off inconvenient truths. But documentation doesn't lie. Military records are cold, precise things. They don't care about pride or reputation. They just state facts: engagements, casualties, equipment status. Zara didn't sound angry or accusatory. She sounded like someone reading from a memo, and that made it hit harder. There was no emotion to argue against, just data. The Rigelian merchant wasn't even pretending to be occupied with his data slate anymore. He set it down carefully, his attention fully on Zara. This was better than any trade negotiation. The pirate bartender stopped wiping the same glass he'd been polishing for the last 10 minutes. His torn tentacle went still. Even the service droid seemed to focus more intently, its red optic brightening as if prioritizing this exchange over background noise. Hartwell tried to recover. He started talking about fog of war, faulty intel, the chaos of combat. But the foundation had cracked. You could see it in the way his audience shifted. Their faces changed from admiration to something closer to curiosity or doubt. They were still listening, but now they were weighing his words against hers, and hers had the weight of official record behind them. Zara didn't press. She didn't need to. She just let the numbers hang there between them. 12, not 60. It wasn't an accusation. It was a correction. And in a place like the Rusty Photon where stories are currency, that kind of correction changes everything. Hartwell's tale of heroism suddenly felt thinner, like a coat of paint over rust. The epic standoff became a manageable firefight. The myth shrank down to size. By the time she finished speaking, the room felt different, quieter. The glow of shared camaraderie had dimmed, replaced by a sharper, more sober attention. Nobody was laughing now. Nobody was nodding along with Hartwell's embellishments. They were all doing the math in their heads. 12 soldiers, 1 droid, a malfunction. It didn't strip away his courage. Fighting 12 Kitherans is still no walk in the park, but it stripped away the grandeur. The story became human-sized again. And maybe that was the point, not to shame him but to ground him, to bring the legend back to Earth. You know how governments need their myths. They're not just stories, they're tools. Useful, polished, strategic tools. And Vega Prime was one of them. Zara didn't say it like she was revealing some grand conspiracy. She said it like she was stating the weather. The truth got buried because it suited both sides. Not out of malice necessarily. Out of convenience. Look at it from the human perspective. You're trying to keep public support for a costly, messy conflict light years from home. People need to believe their soldiers are heroes facing impossible odds. They need to feel like their tax credits are buying victories, not funding stalemates. So when a skirmish like Vega Prime happens, it gets polished up. The numbers get inflated. The stakes get dramatized. It's not lying, it's narrative management. Now flip it. Kitheran High Command had its own problems. They needed to justify their military budget, rally their own people, keep the war factories humming. A humiliating little firefight where 12 soldiers got pinned down by 1 human, and a lucky malfunction doesn't play well on the home front, so they let the exaggerated version stand. Maybe even encouraged it. A worthy adversary makes your own forces look more necessary, more heroic, even in defeat. So Vega Prime wasn't some turning point. It was a minor engagement in a forgotten sector. A patrol that went wrong, a comms breakdown, a brief exchange of fire. The kind of thing that happens every week on a dozen fronts. But it got elevated, framed, painted in bold colors and hung in the gallery of great battles. Not because it was important, but because it was useful. Classified casualty reports did the rest. They locked down the real numbers, the actual sequence of events, buried them under layers of clearance and bureaucracy. The soldiers who were there on both sides never saw the full picture. They got the sanitized version, the public version, the one that made sense for morale, for funding, for politics. Hartwell believed his own story because the system wanted him to. It needed him to. The battle wasn't about winning ground. It was about securing appropriations, shaping perception, convincing senators and generals back home that the war was worth the cost, that the enemy was formidable enough to demand more ships, more troops, more funding. It was a performance, and everyone played their part. Hartwell, his commanders, the Kitheran officers, the politicians on both sides. They all benefited from the myth. Zara laid it out without judgment. She wasn't accusing Hartwell of lying. She was pointing out that he'd been given a role in a play he didn't know he was auditioning for. His bravery was real, his actions mattered, but the context was manufactured. The stakes were engineered. The Outer Rim wars weren't just fought with plasma rifles and dreadnoughts. They were fought with budget reports and press releases, with after-action narratives that served a purpose far beyond the battlefield. By the time she finished, it wasn't about right or wrong. It was about mechanics, how conflicts are sold, how stories become strategy, how truth gets reshaped to fit necessity. Hartwell's tale of 60 shock troops wasn't a lie. It was propaganda. And he was just one of the people who had to carry it. Look, Hartwell expected an alien invader, not a fellow soldier. That's the thing about war. It teaches you to see the other side as a monolith, a threat, a faceless enemy. But Zara wasn't having it. She leaned forward, her posture still relaxed, but her eyes sharp. She wasn't just there to correct his numbers. She was there to challenge the whole framework of his story. The human-centric one where Kithrans were just obstacles, plot devices in a heroic narrative. She let the silence hang for a moment after he finished another polished anecdote, then said it plain. Your species calls it the Outer Rim Wars. I believe we called it Tuesday. The line landed with this dry, almost weary humor. Not a joke, really. More like a fact wrapped in irony. You could hear the pain underneath it, the weariness of being constantly cast as the antagonist in someone else's drama. It wasn't bitterness. It was resignation, the kind that comes from too many years of being misunderstood. She wasn't just setting the record straight. She was reclaiming her people's narrative, pushing back against the idea that her side was just a bunch of faceless invaders with no history, no motives, no stories of their own. For Hartwell, Vega Prime was this defining moment of valor. For her, it was Tuesday, just another day in a long, grinding conflict, one engagement among hundreds. The difference in perspective was staggering. It reframed everything. The cultural divide suddenly felt personal, immediate. They were no longer a human veteran and a Kithran major. They were two soldiers sitting across a sticky bar table, realizing they'd fought in the same war, but experienced completely different conflicts. His was about glory and legends. Hers was about survival and duty. Neither was wrong, but they weren't the same. And that's where the tension really lay. Not in who was right, but in whose story got to be the official version. Laughter broke the tension. Not from the crowd, from Hartwell. A low, surprised chuckle. He got it, the absurdity of it all. The way both sides spin their tales to make sense of the chaos. He didn't apologize. Didn't get defensive. Just shook his head and smiled. It was a coping mechanism, sure. A way to deal with the uncomfortable truth that his epic battle was someone else's routine patrol. But it was also a bridge. Humor does that. It lets you acknowledge hard things without having to declare victory or defeat. At one point, you realize both sides have their own truth. Hartwell's story wasn't a lie. It was his reality, shaped by what he was told, what he believed, what he needed to believe to keep going. Zara's version was just as true, just from the other side of the firing line. The real conflict wasn't between truth and fiction. It was between perspectives. And in that cramped, gravity-glitching bar, those perspectives were finally sitting down together, not to fight but to listen, not to win but to understand, or at least to recognize that understanding might be too much to ask. Maybe listening was enough. So she shows him the evidence that metals can't capture. Zara didn't make a show of it. Just rolled up her sleeve, calm and deliberate, like she was adjusting her cuff. The scar ran from just below her wrist all the way past her elbow, a thick, raised line of pale tissue that stood out against her skin. It wasn't neat. It wasn't clean. It looked like what it was, damage. The kind that leaves a mark long after the wound closes. This wasn't a trophy of victory. It was a reminder of error. She got that scar behind human lines, during what was supposed to be a routine deep reconnaissance mission, not from some glorious firefight, not from holding a position against overwhelming odds. She walked into a trap. A simple, avoidable mistake made by someone who thought she knew better than her training. She was young, overconfident, maybe a little too sure of her own understanding of warfare. It cost her. She said it plain. I got hurt because I was young and stupid and thought I understood warfare better than I actually did. No dramatics. No self-pity. Just a statement of fact. The honesty of it hit harder than any boast about bravery could. It stripped away the romance of combat and left the raw truth exposed. Courage isn't always about charging forward. Sometimes it's about admitting you charged when you shouldn't have. You could see Hartwell taking it in. His eyes stayed on that scar, not with pity or disgust, but with recognition. He'd seen similar marks on himself, on his squad mates, but those were usually framed as badges of honor. Stories to tell over drinks. This was different. This was a lesson etched into skin. A permanent record of a moment when ambition outpaced judgment. His hand went to his bronze star again, but this time it wasn't a defensive gesture. It was thoughtful, like he was weighing the metal against the flesh and bone of her arm. The metal suddenly felt lighter. Not worthless, but different. It represented something official, something sanctioned. Her scar represented something more personal, more real. It wasn't given by a command structure. It was earned through error and survival. The scar running from Zara's wrist to her elbow represents a kind of courage that doesn't get medals. The courage to acknowledge failure, to carry the proof of your mistakes with you not as shame but as experience. It's a map of a bad decision. A reminder that warfare is as much about errors as it is about excellence. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not fight but learn. By the time she's done speaking, courage looks different. It's not just about facing down 60 enemy troops or holding a choke point. It's about facing yourself. About looking at your own errors without flinching. About carrying those lessons forward. Hartwell didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked from his medal to her scar, and you could see the recalibration happening in real time. The story he'd been telling suddenly felt small next to the truth she was showing him. Not because his actions weren't brave, but because her honesty was a different kind of bravery altogether. One that doesn't need amplification or decoration. One that just is. Let me explain what really matters in combat psychology. It's not the numbers on a screen or the official reports. It's what happens inside a soldier's head when the shooting starts. Zara leaned forward, her voice dropping into that flat, analytical tone that officers use when they're breaking down complex maneuvers. She wasn't criticizing Hartwell's courage. She was dissecting the machinery of fear itself. Bravery in the face of overwhelming odds is one thing, she said. Bravery in the face of what you believe to be overwhelming odds is something else entirely. The line hung there between them, simple and devastating. Hartwell thought he faced 60 enemy shock troops. That belief, that certainty of being outnumbered, surrounded, facing almost certain death, shaped every decision he made. It amplified his adrenaline, sharpened his focus, pushed him beyond normal limits. The perception created its own reality. But here's the thing about perception. It doesn't care about facts. Those 12 Kithran soldiers, the actual number, were just as dangerous in their own way. A smaller force can be more precise, more tactical, harder to pin down. They might not have the raw numbers, but they have coordination, discipline, the advantage of knowing the terrain. The real threat wasn't the exaggerated count. It was the training, the weapons, the intent. But fear doesn't process that nuance. Fear sees numbers and multiplies them. Both soldiers experienced the same physiological response. The racing heart, the tunnel vision, the surge of adrenaline that makes time slow down. Hartwell's body didn't know he was facing 12 enemies instead of 60. It just knew he was in danger. It reacted the same way Zara's would have in a similar situation. The chemistry of fear operates on perception, not mathematics. Your nervous system doesn't check the after-action reports before deciding how scared to be. The difference between facing real overwhelming odds versus believing you face them comes down to context. One is a measurable tactical disadvantage. The other is a psychological state that can be just as powerful, just as motivating, just as terrifying. Hartwell's bravery was real because his belief was real. The courage it took to stand his ground wasn't diminished by the actual numbers. If anything, it might have been heightened by the miscalculation. Believing you're facing impossible odds can unlock reserves of determination. That cold logic might not access. Combat psychology shows us that performance under fire depends heavily on what soldiers believe about their situation. Commanders know this. They use it. They frame engagements in ways that maximize confidence, minimize doubt, but sometimes the framing gets distorted. Intel gets exaggerated. Stories get polished. And soldiers like Hartwell end up fighting two battles, one against the actual enemy, and one against the version of the enemy they've been told exists. The truth about courage is more complicated than numbers. It's not just about how many enemies you face. It's about how you face them. What you believe about them. What you believe about yourself. Hartwell's story wasn't less valid because the numbers were wrong. It was just a different kind of truth. A psychological truth. The truth of what he experienced in that moment, filtered through fear, training, and the need to survive. By the time Zara finished speaking, courage looked less like a medal and more like a choice. A choice made in the split second between what's real and what feels real. You know what transcends species and politics? The soldier's experience. That's what Zara and Hartwell found sitting across from each other in that dim, gravity-uneven bar. They should have been enemies. By every rule of engagement, every line drawn on a star chart, they were on opposite sides. But underneath the uniforms and the propaganda, they kept bumping into the same realities, the same fears, the same loyalties. Fear feels the same in any species' nervous system. It doesn't matter if you're human or Kitharan. When plasma fire starts cracking past your head, your heart hammers the same way. Your palms sweat. Your vision tunnels. Zara mentioned it offhand like she was noting the weather. Hartwell just nodded. He didn't need it explained. He'd felt it. That raw animal response to danger doesn't care about politics. It just cares about survival. Loyalty operates under the same principles too. Doesn't matter what flag you're under. When your squad's in trouble, you react. You cover them. You pull them out of fire. You make sure they get home. Zara talked about losing people. Hartwell didn't flinch. He knew that feeling. The hollow ache when someone doesn't make it back. The guilt. The what-ifs. That kind of loyalty isn't taught in basic training. It's forged in the moments when everything goes wrong. Then there's the resolve to protect others. That crosses cultural boundaries like they weren't even there. Zara described standing her ground not for some grand ideal, but because there were people behind her who couldn't defend themselves. Hartwell got quiet. He'd done the same thing. Maybe on a different world, under different skies, but the motive was identical. When it comes down to it, soldiers don't fight for governments. They fight for the person next to them. The bar's audience felt it shift. The Regellian merchant had put his data slate down completely. The pirate bartender was leaning against the counter, not even pretending to work. They were watching something rare. Not our argument. Not a confrontation. A recognition. Two soldiers from opposite sides of a war realizing they'd been living the same life, just wearing different uniforms. They weren't human and Catherine in that moment. They were just soldiers who'd seen combat, who'd felt fear, who'd lost people, who'd made choices they still carried. The divide between them started to feel paper-thin, artificial, like something invented by people who'd never been in the field, who'd never had to rely on the person next to them regardless of what species they were. At one point, the alien becomes familiar. The differences stop mattering as much as the similarities. The way they both hold a drink, steady but with that slight tension in the wrist. The way they scan a room without turning their heads. The way they listen, not just to words but to what's behind them. It's not about forgetting who they are or where they come from. It's about realizing that some experiences are bigger than that. How do two former enemies discover they share the same fears and loyalties? They stop talking about the war and start talking about what it felt like to be in it. The small moments. The jokes told in trenches. The way coffee tastes at 0300 when you're waiting for something to happen. The sound of a friend's voice over comms when everything's going wrong. Those are the things that stick. Not the politics, not the propaganda. The human or Kitharan experiences that don't need translation. By the time they're done comparing notes, the war feels smaller. Not less terrible, but less important than the people who fought it. The barriers between them aren't gone, but they're transparent now. You can see through to the other side, and on the other side you see someone who understands, not an enemy, a fellow soldier. So Zara drops the line that changes everything. She's been listening to Hartwell talk about tactics and troop numbers, about heroics and medals, and then she just says it flat. War stories are rarely about the war. The words hang there, simple and heavy. It's not an accusation, it's an observation. One of those truths that feels obvious once you hear it, but you never quite put it together yourself. She explains it like she's breaking down a mission briefing. Soldiers don't tell these stories to recount battles. They tell them to process trauma, to take the overwhelming sensory chaos of combat, the noise, the fear, the loss, and compress it into something manageable. A narrative. A sequence of events with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Even if that end is polished or exaggerated, it serves a purpose. It makes the unbearable bearable. These stories protect memory. Combat isn't just bullets and explosions. It's details. the smell of ozone and blood, the way light reflects off armor, the sound of someone's last transmission cutting out. Too much detail and the memory becomes a trap, so the mind simplifies. It highlights certain moments, downplays others. It creates a story that can be carried without breaking the person carrying it. Hartwell's embellishments weren't lies. They were therapy, a way to live with what happened without being crushed by it. They also transmit lessons. Veterans share these narratives to prepare the next generation, not with tactical manuals or strategy charts, but with feeling, with the emotional weight of what it's like to be scared, to make hard choices, to lose people.
It's informal training.
The kind that doesn't get written down in official reports but gets passed along in bars like the Rusty Photon. Over drinks, in quiet conversations. One soldier to another, regardless of species or side. The Rusty Photon itself becomes a kind of laboratory for truth. Not factual truth, but emotional truth. A place where stories are told, questioned, sometimes dismantled, but always with the understanding that they matter, that they serve a function. Zara wasn't there to shame Hartwell. She was there to understand why he needed his version, to see the person behind the legend. Why does Zara say war stories are rarely about the war? Because they're about the people who fought it. Their fears, their loyalties, their need to make sense of something that fundamentally doesn't make sense. The war is just the backdrop. The real story is what happens inside the soldier. How they cope, how they remember, how they keep going after the shooting stops. Hartwell gets quiet. You can see him turning it over in his head. His story about 60 Kitharan shock troops wasn't just a boast. It was a way to frame his fear, to give his courage a context he could live with. Zara's correction wasn't just about numbers. It was about showing him that his bravery didn't need exaggeration to be valid. That facing 12 well-trained soldiers was hard enough. That surviving a mistake, like her scar represented, was its own kind of courage. By the time she's done, storytelling itself becomes the subject, not just the tales, but why we tell them, how they shape us, how they heal us, how they sometimes trap us. The bar feels different. Less like a place where legends are built and more like a place where they're understood, where soldiers from opposite sides can sit and recognize that their stories, however different, come from the same place. The need to find meaning in the chaos, to carry the past without being anchored by it. Look, post-war life involves more than parades. Zara leaned back, her drink untouched, and dropped it casually. I'm on medical leave. Not like it was a confession. More like a fact. The kind of thing you might mention about the weather. But in that bar, with that company, it landed differently. Medical leave isn't just time off. It's recalibration, rehabilitation. The slow process of putting a soldier back together after the war has finished with them. Her presence wasn't accidental. It was part of a program. A psychological evaluation designed to assess fitness for duty, not just physical readiness, mental, emotional, the ability to function in a universe that's supposedly at peace but still feels like it's holding its breath. Cultural immersion helps achieve that fitness. You don't just send soldiers back into the field without making sure they can tell friend from foe, policy from prejudice. You make them walk in the other side's shoes. Or in Zara's case, sit in their bars. Governments are calibrating psyches for peaceable coexistence. It's not enough to stop shooting. You have to build something that lasts. That means understanding the people you were trying to kill, learning their tells, their rhythms, what makes them laugh, what makes them defensive. Zara's assessment of humanity wasn't just critique. It was self-reflection. When she noted our capacity for self-deception, our tendency to mythologize, our ability to find meaning in chaos, she was holding up a mirror to her own species too. The Kitharans have their own myths, their own glossed-over battles, their own stories that don't quite match the records. Hartwell realized this meeting might be more than chance. The Rusty Photon wasn't a random stop. It was a classroom, a lab, a controlled environment where a Kitharan officer could observe humans in their natural habitat, boasting, drinking, telling stories that are equal parts truth and therapy. Her questions weren't just curiosity. They were data collection. Her reactions weren't just personal. They were professional. Every laugh, every nod, every moment of understanding was being filed away, processed, analyzed. What psychological evaluation program is Zara participating in, and why? It's the kind that prepares soldiers for the next phase, not combat, diplomacy, cooperation, the messy work of building bridges after you've spent years blowing them up. It's about more than just learning to tolerate the other side. It's about understanding them well enough to work with them, to anticipate their moves, to navigate their bureaucracies, to see the person behind the uniform, whether that uniform is human or Kitharan. The personal becomes political right there at the bar. Every interaction between Zara and Hartwell isn't just two veterans comparing notes. It's a microcosm of interspecies relations, a test case. Can a human pilot who believed he fought 60 Kitharans share a drink with a Kitharan major, who knows the real number was 12? Can they find common ground? Can they move past the propaganda and see each other as individuals? The answers to those questions matter. They don't just affect Zara's fitness evaluation. They affect trade agreements, military cooperation, diplomatic missions. The future of two species trying to figure out how to share a galaxy without constantly trying to dominate it. By the time Zara finishes explaining, the air in the rusty photon feels different, heavier, more significant. The gravity glitches don't seem like malfunctions anymore. They feel like metaphors. The whole universe is unstable, trying to find its new equilibrium, and in that shaky space, two soldiers from opposite sides are doing the same thing. Not fighting, not arguing, just talking. And in that conversation, they're building something new, something that might just last longer than the war that brought them together. Let me tell you how she sees our species. Zara delivered her professional evaluation with the dry precision of someone reading from a psychological profile. No judgment, no agenda, just observation. She'd been studying humans not as enemies, not as allies, but as specimens, behavioral patterns, cultural quirks, and she'd reached some conclusions. An impressive capacity for self-deception, she said, ticking it off like a checklist item. A tendency to mythologize their own actions, and a remarkable ability to find meaning in chaos. Each phrase landed with clinical accuracy. She wasn't trying to insult. She was stating what she'd observed, the way humans reshape reality to fit their needs, how they turn messy, confusing events into clean, heroic narratives, how they manage to extract purpose from situations that should, by all rights, leave them broken. The tension came from how close her observations cut. These weren't alien traits. They were human ones, deeply uncomfortably human, the kind of things we recognize in ourselves but don't always admit. Hartwell didn't get defensive. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly, a half-smile forming. That sounds about right. The admission did more than any diplomatic gesture could. It acknowledged the truth in her assessment without surrendering pride. It was a meeting of minds across what should have been an impossible divide. Here's the thing about Zara's critique. It wasn't just about humanity. She was describing her own people's tendencies as well. Kitharans deceive themselves. They mythologize. They find meaning in their own chaos. She knew it. The recognition was there in her eyes when Hartwell agreed. This wasn't a human problem. It was a soldier problem. A people problem. Maybe a universe problem. The critique became a moment of shared recognition. Not you do this, but we do this. The laughter that followed wasn't the loud, boisterous kind from earlier in the evening. It was quieter, wiser, the kind of laugh that comes when you see your own absurdity reflected in someone else. They weren't laughing at each other. They were laughing at themselves, at their species, at the universal need to pretend we're more in control than we are, more heroic than we are, more certain than we are. How does Zara's assessment of humanity reveal as much about her own species? Because you can't spot a pattern in others without recognizing it in yourself. Her observations were sharp not just because she'd studied humans, but because she'd seen the same behaviors in Kitharan command structures, in her own culture's historical narratives, in the stories her people told about their place in the galaxy. The mirror worked both ways. By the time they're done, they're laughing at themselves together. The human and the Kitharan, finding common ground in their shared flaws, their shared talent for rewriting history, for turning confusion into epic, for making sense of the senseless. It's not a condemnation. It's a bonding moment. The kind that happens when two people realize they're not so different after all. That beneath the uniforms and the propaganda and the sides of a conflict, they're just two beings trying to make sense of a universe that doesn't always cooperate. The assessment stops being about right or wrong, superior or inferior. It becomes about understanding, about seeing the mechanisms that drive both species. The need for narrative, the comfort of legend, the resilience that comes from finding meaning where none exists. Hartwell's story about 60 Kithrans wasn't a lie. It was mythology. And Zara's people have their own versions. They all do. Every species fighting every war. The stories we tell aren't about what happened. They're about what we need to believe happened. And in that need, humans and Kithrans are exactly the same. So where do you go from here? After the stories have been told, the numbers corrected, the scars shown, that's when the real work starts. Zara laid it out with the kind of plain clarity that cuts through barroom philosophizing. We adapt, we learn. We try to do better next time. 3 short sentences that carried the weight of an entire peace process. No grand promises, no sweeping declarations. Just a pragmatic path forward built on incremental progress and honest self-assessment. The conversation shifted from past to future right there. You could feel the energy change. It wasn't about Vega Prime anymore, or troop counts, or whose version of events was more accurate. It was about what comes next. How 2 species that spent years trying to destroy each other might find a way to coexist. Hartwell mirrored the sentiment, his defensiveness giving way to something closer to curiosity. He wasn't just listening. He was absorbing, considering. You could see him turning the idea over in his head, testing its weight. Peace became something active. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of dialogue. Not domination, but understanding. Zara made it clear this wasn't about one side winning or losing. It was about building a framework where both could move forward without repeating the same mistakes. They weren't signing treaties or drawing new borders. They were sketching a blueprint for how to approach disagreement without immediately reaching for weapons. How to question without accusing. How to listen without preparing a counterargument. Curiosity replaced defensiveness. Humility replaced certainty. Hartwell started asking questions instead of making statements. What was Kithran basic training like? How did their command structure handle battlefield promotions? Zara answered without hesitation, but she asked her own questions too. About human medevac procedures, about how Earth-based commanders understood deep space tactics. The conversation became a two-way exchange. An exploration. They were mapping each other's professional landscapes, finding similarities and noting differences without judgment. The night transformed from a victory lap into a reckoning with responsibility. Hartwell wasn't just a veteran telling war stories anymore. He was a participant in something larger, someone who'd been given a glimpse behind the curtain of military propaganda and political narrative, and who now had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Zara wasn't just a Kithran officer correcting the record. She was a soldier trying to build bridges where her people had previously planted flags. They were creating a model right there in that grimy bar. A small-scale example of how conflict resolution might work when you strip away the uniforms and the politics and just leave 2 people who've seen similar things from different angles. The Rusty Photon became a workshop, a place where peace wasn't theorized but practiced, where the messy, complicated work of understanding actually happened between sips of cheap drinks and pauses, filled by the hum of faulty gravity generators, which brings us to their unexpected future. Not as enemies, not as friends, but as something potentially more useful, colleagues. Professionals who'd looked across the divide and seen not monsters or heroes, but complicated beings trying their best with imperfect information and flawed systems. They'd found common ground in their shared failures, their mutual need for narrative, their identical physiological responses to fear. And from that common ground, they were starting to build something new. Not a perfect understanding, but a better questions. Not solutions, but approaches. The work was just beginning. You know how some meetings have consequences, not just in the moment, but down the line. Zara finished her drink and set the glass down with a quiet click. She looked at Hartwell not like a fellow drinker anymore, but like a colleague. A potential asset. She told him this wouldn't be their last conversation, that their paths would cross again, not by accident, by design. In 6 months, a diplomatic crisis would flare up in the Vega system. The details were still forming, but the shape of it was clear. A resource dispute, political posturing, old wounds reopened. The kind of situation that could escalate quickly if handled wrong. Both sides would need officers who could work together. Not just follow protocols, but actually understand each other. Officers who'd looked across the divide and seen a person, not a target. Hartwell and Zara had just spent the evening building that understanding. Their conversation wasn't just bar talk. It was preparation. Their dialogue would be cited in 3 separate academic papers on post-conflict psychology and interspecies relations. Researchers would analyze every exchanged glance, every shift in tone, every moment of recognition. They'd dissect how 2 soldiers from opposing sides found common ground, how they moved from confrontation to collaboration. The rusty photon, with its flickering lights and unreliable gravity, would become a case study, the birthplace of a new approach to peacebuilding. Even the service droid's recording would take on historical significance. That silent, red-eyed witness had captured the entire exchange. Every word, every pause, every shared laugh. What started as routine customer service protocol would become a primary source, a document of how understanding begins. Not in conference rooms or treaty signings, but in dimly lit bars where people are brave enough to question their own stories. Hartwell realized he was part of something beyond himself. This wasn't just about clearing his conscience or correcting the record. It was about contributing to something larger, a shift in how his species and hers might coexist. The weight of that settled on him. You could see it in his posture. The defensiveness gone, replaced by a kind of sober responsibility. He wasn't just a veteran anymore. He was a potential bridge. What diplomatic crisis would bring these 2 veterans together again in 6 months? One that demanded more than military solutions. One that required trust built in advance. The kind of trust that comes from sitting across a table and showing your scars, from admitting your mistakes, from laughing at your own tendency to mythologize. The Vega system would test that trust, push it, see if it could hold under pressure, see if a human pilot and a Kitharan major could prevent a skirmish from becoming something worse. By the time she leaves, the personal has become professional. The handshake they exchange isn't just a farewell. It's a commitment, an unspoken agreement that their conversation matters, that it might actually change things. The rusty photon feels different after she's gone, quieter, more significant. The gravity glitches seem less like malfunctions and more like metaphors. The whole universe feels unstable, searching for a new balance. And in that uncertainty, 2 soldiers have planted a seed, something that might grow into a solution, or at least a better way to ask the questions. Look, sometimes comprehension is overrated. Hartwell reached that conclusion slowly, like a ship coming out of warp. He'd spent the evening trying to understand Zara, her culture, her motives, her version of events. But somewhere between the corrected troop counts and the shared laughter, he realized that full understanding might be impossible. You don't need to fully grasp someone's entire reality to respect their experience. Sometimes it's enough just to listen. The line landed with the weight of hard-earned wisdom. Understanding is overrated, he said, almost to himself. Sometimes it's enough just to listen. It wasn't a dismissal. It was an acknowledgement, an admission that some divides are too wide to cross with comprehension alone, that the gap between human and Kitharan experience might never fully close, but that doesn't mean you stop trying to bridge it. You just use different materials. Instead of analysis, you use attention. Instead of judgment, you use curiosity. The act of listening becomes its own form of peacebuilding. It's not passive. It's active. It requires setting aside your own narrative, your own need to be right, your own framework for understanding the universe. It means letting someone else's truth exist alongside yours without immediately trying to reconcile them, without forcing them to fit. Hartwell and Zara had been doing that all evening, listening to stories that didn't match, experiences that contradicted, perspectives that should have been incompatible. And instead of arguing, they'd just listened. The bar's various species demonstrated this in microcosm. The pirate bartender with his torn tentacle, listening to war stories from a dozen different species without ever taking sides. The Rigelian merchant, absorbing market gossip and battle accounts with equal attention. The service droid, recording everything without interpretation. They weren't trying to understand each other in some deep philosophical sense. They were just sharing space, listening, letting different realities coexist in the same room. Why do Rex and Zara agree that listening matters more than understanding? Because comprehension requires common ground. It demands that both parties share enough context, enough framework, that things make sense to both of them. But after a war, that common ground has been shelled to pieces. The frameworks don't match anymore. Listening doesn't require common ground. It just requires presence, the willingness to hear someone's truth without immediately measuring it against your own. You don't need to fully comprehend someone to respect their experience. Respect comes from acknowledging that their experience exists, that it matters to them, that it shaped them. Hartwell didn't need to understand Ketheran military culture to respect Zara's service. He just needed to hear her stories, to see her scar, to recognize that whatever she'd been through, it had left marks, same as his experiences had left marks on him. The marks were different. The respect could be the same. At one point, silence speaks louder than any story. There were moments in their conversation where neither of them spoke, where they just sat with what had been said, let it settle. Didn't try to explain it or build on it or argue with it. Just let it exist. Those silences did more work than all their words combined. They created space for the ununderstandable to just be, for the differences to sit there without resolution, for the gap between their experiences to remain but to become less threatening. The value of listening over understanding isn't about giving up on comprehension. It's about recognizing that comprehension takes time, that it builds slowly, brick by brick, story by story. And while you're building that understanding, you need something to hold the space. Listening does that. It keeps the door open. It says, I may not get it yet, but I'm here. I'm paying attention. In a universe full of species that don't think alike, that might be the most peaceful thing you can do. Just listen. Let me describe how this bar mirrors the galaxy. The rusty photon isn't just a place to drink. It's a scale model of interstellar society compressed into one dim, gravity-glitching room. Every element you'd find out there in the wider universe exists here in miniature, playing out the same dynamics with cheaper drinks and stickier floors. The unreliable gravity represents that fragile stability we see across the sector. 1 minute everything's normal, the next your drink's floating and you're grabbing the table for balance. It's exactly how peace feels these days. Precarious, unpredictable, like the whole system could destabilize if one component fails. The pirate bartender with his torn tentacle backstory stands in for all the refugees and displaced beings trying to make a living in the margins. His silence speaks volumes about just listening to everyone's stories without taking sides, a skill the entire galaxy could use more of. Then there's the Rigelian merchant practicing cautious diplomacy in real time. He's not here for the stories. He's here to gauge tensions, assess risks, maybe find business opportunities in the aftermath of conflict. He represents all the neutral parties navigating between warring factions, trying to profit from peace without getting caught in the crossfire. The service droid recording everything embodies our obsession with documentation and history. It's gathering data without context, preserving moments that might mean nothing now but could change everything later. Humans and aliens navigate this shared space with the same careful dance we see on station promenades and trade hubs. They maintain personal distance while sharing oxygen, respect unspoken boundaries while brushing past each other, negotiate territory at the bar without ever stating terms outright. Everyone's learning to live with difference in close quarters. The Ketheran major, the human veteran, the tentacled bartender, the merchant from Rigelius, they're all crammed into this imperfect space, making it work despite their differences. How does a single night in a dive bar become a blueprint for interstellar peace? It demonstrates the mechanics of coexistence on a manageable scale. Shows that understanding doesn't require treaties or grand gestures, just people sharing space, listening to each other's stories, recognizing common ground in unexpected places. The solutions aren't in conference rooms with polished tables. They're in places like this where the gravity fails and the air tastes like metal, and people have to adapt. The universe in miniature exists right here with cheap drinks and worn-out stools. All the elements are present. The tensions, the diplomacy, the history-making, the quiet moments of connection. What happened between Hartwell and Zara wasn't unique. It was inevitable. Put beings from different worlds in close quarters with alcohol and shared trauma, and eventually the barriers come down. The stories get questioned. The truth comes out. Not always neatly, not always completely, but enough to build on. This is how peace gets built. Not in massive diplomatic initiatives, but in small, messy interactions where people choose listening over fighting, curiosity over suspicion, shared laughter over entrenched positions. The rusty photon proves that the galaxy doesn't need perfect understanding. It just needs more spaces where imperfect understanding can happen, where different species can occupy the same room long enough to realize they're not so different after all, where a human veteran and a Ketheran major can discover that beneath the uniforms and propaganda, they're just two tired soldiers trying to make sense of a universe that's never quite stable. So what actually changes after tonight? Plenty. Their dialogue doesn't just fade into the bar's haze. It ripples outward, touching things far beyond the rusty photon's shaky gravity field. Personal reconciliation has professional consequences. That's how these things work. You don't sit down with someone who should be your enemy, find common ground, and then just go back to business as usual. The universe doesn't work that way. Academic works will cite their conversation in studies of interspecies relations. Researchers will analyze every exchanged glance, every shift in tone, every moment where two soldiers from opposing sides recognize something familiar in each other. They'll write papers on post-conflict psychology, using this night as a case study in how understanding begins, not with grand gestures but with small, honest moments, with someone showing a scar instead of waving a medal, with someone admitting their story might need correction. Military training programs might incorporate their insights, not as formal doctrine but as anecdotal evidence. Instructors might use this encounter to show cadets that the enemy isn't always a monster, that they have their own fears, their own loyalties, their own reasons for fighting, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't charge forward, but sit down and listen. That perception matters as much as reality when it comes to courage. The Vega System diplomatic crisis will test their new understanding. In 6 months, when tensions flare and old wounds threaten to reopen, officers from both sides will need to work together. Not just follow protocols, but actually trust each other. Hartwell and Zara will be there. Their conversation in this bar will become more than just a memory. It will be a foundation. A reference point. Proof that cooperation is possible, even between species that spent years trying to destroy each other. Two soldiers from opposite sides found common ground. That might not sound like much in the grand scheme of things. It won't stop wars or rewrite treaties overnight. But it's progress. The kind that matters. The kind that starts small and grows. One conversation leads to another. One understanding leads to broader acceptance. It deserves celebration, however small, because these are the building blocks of peace. Not massive diplomatic initiatives, but individual connections. The universe remains complicated, but now has one less enemy. That's the real legacy. Not that everything is fixed, but that something has shifted. The relationship between human and Kithran forces isn't the same after tonight. It can't be. When two career soldiers from opposing armies can sit in a bar, compare experiences, and find more similarities than differences, it changes the landscape. Maybe only by a few degrees, but sometimes a few degrees is all you need to avoid collision. The rusty photon becomes more than just a bar. It becomes a symbol, a place where understanding happened despite everything, despite the unreliable gravity, despite the worn-down atmosphere, despite the years of conflict and propaganda. It proves that peace doesn't require perfect conditions. It just requires willingness. The willingness to question your own stories, to listen to someone else's, to recognize that your truth might not be the only truth. Which brings us to the final truth about war stories. They're not about the war. They're about the people who fought it. Their need to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. Their need to carry the past without being crushed by it. Their need to find meaning in chaos. Hartwell and Zara understood that by the end. Their stories were different, but the need behind them was the same. And in that need, they found common ground. In that need, they found a way forward. The universe stays complicated, but sometimes you find progress in unlikely places, like a dive bar where two soldiers from opposite sides actually listen to each other. That's worth celebrating. Sometimes the bravest thing isn't holding a position or charging ahead. It's sitting across from someone who should be your enemy and hearing their story. Next time you hear a perfect war tale, ask whose voice is missing, who wasn't there to give their version. The truth's rarely simple, but it's always better when more voices join the telling.